of any state and the highest number of STEM graduates, but it also has an extraordinary high poverty and unemployment rate, especially in our urban centers. What would you do as governor to bridge this huge poverty divide in Maryland?
First, I would address the income wage inequality that I discussed in my opening statement. And I think that we have to do that by not just having a minimum wage increase, but a living wage. I propose that we get us on a path to $16.70 an hour by the year 2022. And we can index this to inflation so that wages don't lose their value as the cost of living goes up. Right now, the wage increase that we just passed won't get to 1010 until this next governor is done with their first term. We have to wait until 2018 for that wage to get to 1010. And because it's not indexed to inflation, in 6 years, that wage will be worth $8.06. We have to have it indexed to inflation. We have to address our tipped wage workers. Do you know that people who work for tips only get paid $3.63 an hour? We have to make sure that when we're increasing those wages that we increase the tipped wage workers, because a majority of tipped wage workers are women and people of color. And if our income gap isn't addressed, we're going to continue to see the widening happen in our communities. We will continue to address this through our tax policies. If the O'Malley-Brown administration allowed the millionaire's tax to expire, and then went ahead to increase taxes on all the rest of us. If we bring back the millionaire's tax, we could generate enough revenue to give 90% of all Marylanders tax cuts. And if we close the corporate tax loopholes that a handful of companies use to avoid paying taxes that they make here in Maryland, we could generate as much as $200 million in new revenue that I would dedicate to small business tax relief, including focusing a certain higher percentage of that on minority-owned businesses.
I do want to recognize Delegate Jill Carter has joined us. One of my favorite community actors, I'm going to get in trouble, one of the greatest actresses in the country. Sonia Sohn is here also. Men and women return to our community every year from incarceration, but they are not given resources and skills to become contributing members of society. What is your commitment to those who re-enter our community every year so that they can get jobs and resources to be good citizens?
Thank you so much. I have a plan that is about no longer making sure that we are tough on crime. That hasn't worked. Right. We have to be smart on crime. Yes. And as a part of that plan, you will find, and all of these plans are on my website, by the way, you will find a big section related to mass incarceration reform. I stood up early on to fight the O'Malley-Brown administration's proposal to build a new youth jail in this city because they were going to build 120-bed facility for what were 40 youth in the system at the time at a cost of $70 million. And we know if you build it, you'll fill it. We need to be spending those monies on affirmative opportunities. And I led the charge in this legislative session to make sure that we decriminalize possession of marijuana so that we're not sending people to jail anymore for those nonviolent offenses. I want to go in and get people out who are in jail for that purpose after we legalize marijuana. People shouldn't be sitting in jail for those nonviolent offenses. But when you get out of jail, how do we make sure that it's not just a revolving door? That you have access to a job? Well, we want to ban the box. We want to put through shielding. We want to make sure that our reentry programs are focused on disconnecting people from returning to lives of crime. And that comes back to us being community again. Us connecting to each other. Opening our doors. Working with our employers. Having programs inside our prison population like the Jericho Project, like Friend of a Friend, like services are working incredibly well where they exist, but we haven't made it throughout the system across the board. Re-entry starts at entry, and nobody is beyond redemption. And we have to start changing attitudes in order to change the results at the end of the day. And I encourage you to look at our 18-page criminal justice reform package, because I propose that we eliminate mandatory minimum sentences, that we reform our money bail system and stop putting a price on people's freedom through the money bail system. All of these reforms you'll find in the approach that Delman Coates and I have advanced for an entirely different way of viewing how we interact with each other and to view these issues in a more holistic way.
Delegate Mazur, this question is, do you have a plan for drug treatment and addiction treatment for folks who are in need but cannot afford the oftentimes expensive and insurance-driven treatment plans that are available to them?
So when I came out with my proposal last November to legalize marijuana, at the time, I could tell when I started having this conversation in certain communities, people were like, oh my God, she's talking about legalizing marijuana. I'm not sure if I'm comfortable about this. And we pushed the dialogue over and over and over again to make the case about why our marijuana laws have been such a failure. And that they're enforced with racial bias. And that when we legalize and bring this market from the underground economy into the light of day, we move drug dealers off to the side. We improve our chances of keeping drugs out of the hands of youth, because what drug dealer parts for an ID? And we have the opportunity to educate our children about the dangers of a substance on a developing mind. But we know in terms of marijuana, for adults, it's no more toxic, no more harmful to the body, and no more addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and so we should treat it that way. We also know, though, that when people are going to a drug dealer to get marijuana, there's an upsell. Hey, how about this product? How about that product? And you're right, drug treatment and addiction services are not adequately funded in our state. But when we stop spending $280 million a year on the incarceration, detention, and court costs associated with the nonviolent marijuana possession charges, we can have the resources to invest in quality programs like drug treatment and addiction services. And in our proposal, we're using some of that revenue to fund the approach related to drug treatment and addiction services.
Delegate Mazur, how do you propose to fund Phase 2 of the plan to renovate and reconstruct Baltimore City Public Schools? A great deal of media attention and celebration around Phase 1, but it does no one any good if we aren't committed to spending more dollars for education.
Absolutely, and a big congratulations to the entire Baltimore City delegation who worked so hard to make sure that we got that first $1 billion of revenue for our city schools. I had the good fortune of being engaged in this conversation from the beginning. I'm Vice Chair of Education and Economic Development for the Appropriations Committee. And I toured Baltimore City schools in 2011 and was devastated by what I saw. Toilets that wouldn't flush, the kids can't drink out of the water fountains because there's lead pipes, doors that won't close, the big gaping holes in infrastructure. And I could have gone home and said, I'm from Montgomery County, that's Baltimore's problem. But I have always believed that we are only successful to the extent that all of our children are successful. And in 2011, I co-authored an editorial that was printed in the Baltimore Sun with Tom Wilcox of the Baltimore Community Foundation to highlight a range of ideas of how we could generate enough revenue to rebuild Baltimore City schools. Because while it's a crisis across the state, a $15 billion backlog in school construction all across the state, when you're approaching a $3 billion crisis in the city, that's the most acute problem that we have to tackle first. Baltimore schools were our #1 priority. But just getting the first $1 billion of revenue in the door isn't sufficient. And some of the ideas that I have advanced for Phase 2 and 3 funding include these two ideas I will leave with you tonight. One is, it always works for us to follow what other states have done well. And in Iowa and Georgia, they have passed programs called the School Infrastructure Local Option Act, or SILO for short. They give local jurisdictions the option to put to a voter referendum. You get to decide. You get to vote. Do you want to raise your sales tax by 1 penny for the dedicated purpose of putting it in a school construction fund? In both of those states, and particularly in Iowa, it was so successful that 2 or 3, 5 or 6 different jurisdictions would pass it, and then a neighboring jurisdiction would drive through and see their fancy new schools and say, why don't we have schools like that? And then they'd start talking to their neighbors and they'd say, oh, you got to pass this referendum to get it. And when you do, the money really does go to that? Yes, it does. Wow, okay. Before you know it, the entire state of Iowa took it up in every single jurisdiction. And so what works in Iowa and Georgia certainly can work in Maryland. This is one additional idea for revenue in the state. And another is to grow the number of partners that we have in thinking through where we leverage money to do this. I've proposed sitting down with the building and construction trades unions, our bricklayers, our steam fitters, the electricians, the drywall workers, and having a conversation about whether or not they would be willing to invest a portion of their pension fund into the School Construction Bonding Authority in exchange for project labor agreements that would guarantee when we're rebuilding those schools, we're using union jobs and local union labor to get the job done. It could be a win-win benefit for us all. But it's going to take smart, creative ideas for us to continue generating the revenue necessary to get this big bill done, and I'm the candidate that's committed to doing it.
Delegate Mazier, we often see politicians during election years and then not see them again until the next election. Do you commit tonight that between these elections, you will visit urban centers in Baltimore City? We see you a lot now. Will we see you if you are elected governor?
But of course, I'm pretty sure that Stephanie Rawlings Blake's going to start charging me taxes soon. I spend so much time in the city. Past is prologue. I started working in this city 3 years before I ever dreamed of running for governor. When I was walking through and touring the schools and sitting down with the Baltimore Education Coalition and Build and the ACLU Education Reform Project, that was 2011. I was doing that because I cared about the city and the issues that impact you. When I was standing next to Joe Carter's side fighting against the youth jail in 2011, it wasn't because I had some grand plan 3 years later to announce that I was going to run for governor. It's because I cared about these issues. It's because I saw both the challenges and the opportunities that exist in the city. And I'm a friend of Baltimore, not just because it's an election year, but because I have friends here. I care about the issues that are impacting the city, and I love offering up my energy and enthusiasm and creative thinking on how we can come together to solve these big problems.
We have 5 minutes left. Delegate Mazier, would you like to make your closing statement, or do you want to take another question?
I think I do one more